black girl tells Judge, "You're my dad." He instantly breaks into tears. Sometimes, life has a way of throwing us into the most unexpected stories. For Judge Matthew Coleman, it was supposed to be just another day in family court, another case, another file. But when a 13-year-old girl walked into his courtroom with a shocking revelation, his world turned upside down. What do you do when the past you thought you left behind comes rushing back? When a single question changes everything you thought you knew? This is the story of a judge, a lost daughter, and the unbreakable bond that forms between them. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the Story Atelier. Your support helps us bring powerful, life-changing stories like this to you every week. Because every story has the power to inspire. The courtroom buzzed with its usual low murmur as people filed in, waiting for their cases to be heard. Judge Matthew Coleman adjusted his glasses, scanning the docket for the day. As a family court judge for over 2 decades, he was no stranger to the emotional turbulence these cases carried. Broken families, neglected children, and strained relationships, he had seen it all. Yet, today something felt different, though he couldn't quite place it. "Next case, Your Honor," the clerk announced. Matthew glanced at the file in front of him. Taylor, Emily, a 13-year-old girl caught in the foster care system. Her case had escalated due to concerns over her current living situation. He adjusted his robe and prepared to address the room. The doors opened, and Emily walked in, flanked by her social worker. She was small for her age, with curly auburn hair tied back into a messy ponytail. Her oversized jacket hung awkwardly on her frame. But it was her eyes that drew everyone's attention. They were sharp, filled with equal parts defiance and vulnerability. She scanned the room briefly before sitting at the defendant's table, her posture tense but composed. "Good morning, Miss Taylor," Matthew began, his voice steady. "I understand this case involves your current placement and concerns brought by your social worker. Is that correct?" Emily nodded, her lips pressed into a firm line. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her tone measured, almost too adult for her age. Matthew's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than he intended. There was something oddly familiar about her. Shaking off the thought, he turned his attention to the social worker, who began outlining Emily's turbulent history, her mother's untimely death, the revolving door of foster homes, and the neglect she had endured. "She's resilient," the social worker noted, "but understandably guarded. Emily's been let down many times." Matthew listened carefully, but his focus kept drifting back to the girl. Her demeanor was striking. Most children in her position were either fearful or apathetic. But not Emily. She held herself with a confidence that seemed almost unnatural for someone her age. When it was Emily's turn to speak, she stood up without prompting, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "Your Honor, I've been in this system for 3 years. I've lived in homes where no one cared about me, where I was just another check. All I want is to find a place where I matter." Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. The room fell silent, save for the faint scratching of the stenographer's pen. Matthew felt a pang of emotion he couldn't quite name. Empathy, perhaps, or guilt. "What are you hoping for today?" he asked gently. For the first time, Emily hesitated, her bravado faltered, and she looked down at her hands, twisting the hem of her jacket. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. "I want answers. About my mom. About you." Matthew's brow furrowed in confusion. "About me?" Emily lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes directly. "Yes," she said, her words steady now. "My mom used to talk about someone She called him Matt. I need to know if that's you. The room froze. Matthew stared at the girl, his mind racing. Could it be possible? Her name, Taylor, didn't immediately register. Yet, her eyes, the set of her jaw, there was an undeniable familiarity. The social worker cleared her throat, breaking the tension. Your Honor, perhaps we should address this matter outside of court proceedings. Matthew nodded slowly, his composure returning. Miss Taylor, your safety and well-being are our priority. We'll revisit your concerns in due time. Emily nodded, her face unreadable, and sat down, but Matthew couldn't shake the unease that settled over him. As the session continued, he found it increasingly difficult to focus. Who was this girl, and why did she feel like a piece of a puzzle he didn't know he was missing? When the hearing adjourned, Matthew returned to his chambers, the girl's words echoing in his mind. My mom used to talk about someone. Matt. He sat at his desk, staring blankly at the docket. His mind wandered back to a different time. Years ago, there had been a woman, Anna Taylor. She was spirited, intelligent, and had a laugh that could light up any room. They'd met during his early years as a public defender, but their relationship was brief, derailed by career ambitions and life pulling them in different directions. Could Emily really be Anna's daughter? His daughter? A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was his clerk. Your Honor, there's someone here to see you. Send them in, Matthew said, straightening his tie. The social worker entered, clutching a file. Judge Coleman, she began. I thought it might be helpful to provide some context about Emily's background. She handed him a photograph. It was a candid shot of a smiling woman with curly auburn hair, Anna. Beside her stood a younger Emily, her small hand clutching her mother's. Matthew's breath caught. The resemblance was undeniable. She was a devoted mother. The social worker said softly. She worked hard to provide for Emily. But when she got sick, things changed. Sick? Matthew asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Cancer, the social worker confirmed. She passed 3 years ago. Matthew's chest tightened as guilt and grief intertwined. Anna had faced the greatest challenge of her life, and he hadn't been there. And now, Emily was in front of him, searching for answers he wasn't sure he could provide. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation settling over him. If Emily was truly his daughter, his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. But one thing was certain, he couldn't turn away. Judge Matthew Coleman sat alone in his chambers, the photograph of Anna and Emily resting on his desk like a ghost from his past. He couldn't deny the resemblance anymore, the sharpness in Emily's gaze, the way her jaw set stubbornly, were traits he remembered vividly from Anna. Yet, there was no definitive proof. Could this girl really be his daughter? He knew he needed answers, but he also knew he had to proceed cautiously. Later that day, Matthew requested a private meeting with Emily and her social worker, Ms. Carter. They met in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. The air was thick with unspoken tension as Emily sat across from him, her arms crossed and her expression guarded. Thank you for meeting with me, Emily, Matthew began, keeping his tone calm and measured. I wanted to address the questions you raised earlier. Emily raised an eyebrow, her voice sharp. You mean about my mom and you? Matthew nodded. Yes, I want to understand more about what your mom told you. Ms. Carter interjected cautiously. Your Honor, I must remind you to approach this carefully. Emily has been through a lot, and this could be overwhelming for her. I understand, Matthew replied, turning his attention back to the girl. Emily, I'm not here to make any assumptions, but I want to help. And I think the best way to do that is to learn the truth together. Emily hesitated, glancing between Matthew and Ms. Carter before speaking. My mom used to talk about someone named Matt. She said softly. She didn't say much, just that he was a good man, but he didn't know about me. The words struck Matthew like a punch to the gut. If what she said was true, Anna had chosen not to tell him. But why? Had he been so consumed with his career back then that she thought he wouldn't care? The guilt that had been simmering all day now boiled to the surface. Emily, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. I knew your mother a long time ago. She was an incredible woman. But I didn't know about you. Emily's expression softened, but only slightly. Why not? She asked. Her voice tinged with both curiosity and frustration. If you knew her, why didn't you stay in touch? Matthew swallowed hard. Life took us in different directions. I thought about her often. But I didn't reach out, and for that, I'm sorry. The room fell silent for a moment. Ms. Carter broke the tension by pulling a folder from her bag and sliding it across the table. Judge Coleman, I believe a paternity test is the most straightforward way to confirm the truth. If Emily agrees, we can arrange for it. Emily's eyes darted to the folder, then back to Matthew. Will it hurt? She asked cautiously. Matthew offered a small, reassuring smile. Not at all. Just a cheek swab. Quick and painless. Emily bit her lip, then nodded. Okay, let's do it. The following day, the test was administered. A technician came to the courthouse to collect samples from both Matthew and Emily. The procedure was simple, but the weight of its implications was anything but. As the technician worked, Emily sat stiffly in her chair, her gaze fixed on the window. Matthew tried to ease the tension. Do you like school? He asked. Attempting small talk. Emily shrugged. It's okay. I like art class the most. Math, not so much. Matthew chuckled softly. I was terrible at math too. Guess that's one thing we might have in common. Emily glanced at him briefly, a flicker of amusement crossing her face before she turned back to the window. We'll see. After the samples were collected, the technician assured him the results would be ready in a few days. As Emily and Ms. Carter prepared to leave, Matthew stopped them. Emily, he said, his voice gentle, no matter what the results say, I want you to know I'm here for you. You deserve answers, and you deserve someone who cares. Emily's expression remained unreadable, but there was a glimmer of something in her eyes, hope. Perhaps. She gave a small nod before walking out the door. The waiting was excruciating. Matthew buried himself in his work, presiding over cases with a level of focus that bordered on obsessive. Yet, no matter how many dockets he reviewed or hearings he presided over, his thoughts always circled back to Emily. 3 days later, the envelope arrived. Matthew sat in his chambers, staring at it as if it were a live grenade. With a deep breath, he opened it and scanned the document. His heart pounded as his eyes landed on the words he both dreaded and hoped for. Paternity confirmed. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation crashing over him. Emily was his daughter. The timeline, the resemblance, the results, it all made sense now. But knowing the truth was only the beginning. He had spent 13 years unaware of her existence. And now he had to figure out how to be the father she needed. The next meeting with Emily was scheduled for the following day. Matthew felt a mix of anticipation and nerves as he waited in the same conference room where they had spoken before. When Emily walked in, her expression was the same as always, guarded, skeptical, but this time, there was a hint of curiosity as well. Matthew slid the test results across the table. I wanted you to see this, he said simply. Emily picked up the paper and read it. Her fingers tightened on the edges. And for a moment, she said nothing. Then, in a quiet voice, she asked, "So, it's true?" Matthew nodded. "It's true." Emily set the paper down, her face unreadable. "What happens now?" Matthew leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Now, we figure this out together. I want to be a part of your life. Emily, I know I've missed so much. And I can't change the past. But I want to be here for you. For everything." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "Why now?" she finally asked. "Why do you care all of a sudden? You didn't even know I existed a week ago." Her words stung, but Matthew didn't shy away. "You're right," he admitted. "I didn't know, and I'll never stop regretting that. But now that I do, I'm not going to walk away. You deserve someone who shows up for you. And I'm going to prove that I can be that person." Emily's jaw tightened, but her eyes softened. "We'll see," she said simply. It wasn't an acceptance, not yet, but it was a start. And for Matthew, that was enough. The days following the paternity test results were a whirlwind of emotion for Judge Matthew Coleman. Knowing the truth had changed everything, but it also brought new challenges. How did he build a relationship with a daughter who had spent her entire life without him? How could he earn her trust when so many others had let her down? Matthew knew that the first step was to spend time with Emily outside of the sterile environment of the courthouse. He arranged a meeting at a nearby diner, a casual spot he thought might make her feel more at ease. Emily arrived with Ms. Carter, her social worker, who had agreed to stay in the background to observe. Matthew stood as Emily approached the booth. "Hey, Emily," he said, offering a smile. "Thanks for meeting me." Emily slid into the seat across from him, her arms crossed. "Ms. Carter said I had to." Matthew chuckled softly, unoffended. "Fair enough. But I'm glad you came anyway." A server approached, setting down menus. "Order whatever you like," Matthew said, trying to sound relaxed. "My treat." Emily glanced at the menu but said nothing. After a moment, she muttered, "I'll just have a burger." "Good choice," Matthew replied, gesturing for the server to take the order. "I'll have the same." When the server left, an awkward silence settled over the table. Matthew searched for a way to break it. "So, Ms. Carter tells me you're into art. What kind of things do you like to draw?" Emily shrugged. Stuff. Huh, Matthew grinned. "Buildings, people, animals." Emily hesitated before answering. "Buildings. Mostly. I like architecture. My mom used to say I should be an architect someday." Matthew's heart tightened at the mention of Anna. "She was right," he said gently. "If that's something you want to do, I'd love to help you pursue it." Emily glanced at him briefly, then looked away. "We'll see." Their food arrived, providing a brief distraction. As they ate, the conversation began to flow more naturally. Emily shared tidbits about her school and favorite classes, and Matthew told her stories from his early days as a lawyer. He tried not to overwhelm her with questions, letting her open up at her own pace. By the end of the meal, Emily's posture had relaxed slightly, and she even cracked a small smile when Matthew told her about his first disastrous attempt at cooking spaghetti. "You're not great at this dad stuff, are you?" she teased. Matthew laughed, relieved by the teasing tone in her voice. "I'm still learning, but I promise I'll get better." Over the next few weeks, Matthew made it a priority to show Emily he was serious about being in her life. He attended her school meetings, visited her foster home, and arranged outings to the library and local art exhibits. Slowly but surely, the walls she had built around herself began to crack. One afternoon, Matthew invited Emily to his home for dinner. He had spent the entire day cleaning and cooking, determined to make a good impression. Emily arrived with Ms. Carter, her expression wary as she stepped inside. "It's neat," Emily said, glancing around the living room. "I'll take that as a compliment," Matthew replied with a chuckle. "Come on, dinner's ready." He led her to the dining table, where plates of spaghetti and garlic bread were waiting. Emily raised an eyebrow. "You're really sticking with the spaghetti thing?" "Huh," Matthew grinned. "It's a classic. Plus, I've had some practice since the first disaster." Emily took a bite and nodded approvingly. "Not bad." They ate in companionable silence for a while before Matthew brought out a photo album. "I thought you might like to see some old pictures," he said, sliding the album across the table. Emily hesitated, then opened the album. She flipped through pages of photographs from Matthew's younger years, graduation, his first job as a public defender, and candid shots with friends. Her fingers paused on a picture of Matthew with a group of colleagues, one of whom was unmistakably Anna. "That's her," Emily said softly. "My mom." Matthew nodded, his throat tightening. "She was amazing, funny, smart, and so full of life." Emily traced the edge of the photograph with her finger. "She used to tell me stories about you," she said quietly. "She said you were stubborn but kind." Matthew smiled sadly. She wasn't wrong. Emily looked up at him, her expression serious. "Why didn't you stay in touch?" Matthew sighed, his guilt surfacing again. "I wish I had. I let my career take over, and I lost sight of what really mattered. If I'd known about you, things would have been different." Emily didn't respond, but her gaze softened. For the first time, Matthew felt a glimmer of hope that she might be willing to let him in. As their relationship grew, so did the challenges. Emily had spent years in the foster system, learning to rely on herself and trust no one. Even with Matthew's consistent presence, she struggled to let go of her defenses. One evening, after an argument about her curfew, Emily stormed into her room and slammed the door. Matthew waited a few minutes before knocking gently. "Emily, can we talk?" The door creaked open, and Emily glared at him. "What?" Matthew kept his voice calm. "I'm not mad. I just want to understand what's going on." Emily sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm not used to this," she admitted, having someone care. Matthew's heart ached at her words. "I know it's new, and I know I have a lot to learn. But I'm here for the long haul. You don't have to do this alone anymore." Emily's glare softened, and she nodded reluctantly. "Okay, but don't expect me to change overnight. I wouldn't dream of it," Matthew replied with a smile. Despite the setbacks, their bond continued to strengthen. Matthew discovered that Emily had a sharp wit and a dry sense of humor that often caught him off guard. She shared more about her dreams of becoming an architect, even showing him sketches of her designs. "You're really talented," Matthew said one evening as they sat together in the living room. "I can see you designing skyscrapers someday." Emily shrugged, but her cheeks flushed with pride. "Maybe, we'll see." For Matthew, every small moment of connection felt like a victory. He knew they still had a long way to go, but he was determined to earn her trust and be the father she deserved. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of falling leaves as Judge Matthew Coleman prepared for a day he knew would be emotionally heavy. After weeks of tentative conversations and growing trust, Emily had surprised him by agreeing to visit her mother's grave. It wasn't something he had pushed. He wanted her to come to terms with it in her own time, but when she brought it up, he immediately made arrangements. The cemetery was a few hours away in Anna's hometown. They set out early in the morning, the silence between them broken only by the hum of the car engine and the occasional rustle of Emily flipping through a book she had brought along. Matthew glanced at her occasionally, wondering what was going through her mind but resisting the urge to pry. "You okay?" he asked after a long stretch of quiet. Emily shrugged without looking up. "I guess. Just feels weird." Matthew nodded. "That's normal. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to." She gave a non-committal hum and returned to her book. Matthew let the conversation drop, respecting her need for space. When they arrived, the cemetery was quiet, with only the faint rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds breaking the stillness. Matthew parked the car and got out, watching as Emily hesitated before stepping onto the gravel path. She held a small bouquet of daisies tightly in her hand, her knuckles white from the grip. "Take your time," Matthew said softly, standing back to let her lead the way. Emily walked slowly, her steps tentative as she scanned the rows of headstones. When she found the one with her mother's name, Anna Taylor, she stopped, her breath hitching slightly. She knelt down and placed the flowers at the base of the headstone, her fingers brushing against the cold granite. "Hi, Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady. "I'm here." Matthew stood a few feet away, giving her the privacy he knew she needed. Emily stayed quiet for a long time, her fingers tracing the engraved letters of Anna's name. Finally, she began to speak, her words raw and unfiltered. "I wish you were here," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I wish you could see me. I'm okay. Well, sort of. I'm trying. And I found him. The guy you used to talk about. Matt. He's here, too." She turned slightly to glance at Matthew, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He's trying. Mom, I think you'd like him." Matthew felt his chest tighten, his throat thick with emotion. He stepped closer, kneeling beside her. "She'd be proud of you, Emily," he said softly, "and I'm honored to be here with you." Emily nodded, wiping her eyes quickly as if to hide her tears. "I didn't think it would feel like this," she admitted, "like she's still here somehow." "She is," Matthew replied, his voice steady. "In you. In everything you do." Emily didn't respond, but she leaned slightly against him, a quiet gesture of trust that spoke volumes. They stayed there for a while, the silence between them filled with unspoken emotions and a sense of connection neither had expected. The drive back home was lighter, the tension from earlier replaced by a quiet sense of peace. Emily seemed more relaxed, even humming softly along to the music on the radio. Matthew glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you for letting me come with you," he said after a while. Emily shrugged but gave him a sideways glance that held a hint of warmth. "It was good. I'm glad we went." They pulled into the driveway as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the house. Inside, Emily immediately retreated to her room, leaving Matthew to reflect on the day. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the photo of Anna and Emily that Ms. Carter had given him weeks ago. For the first time, he felt like he was truly honoring Anna's memory, not just by acknowledging the past but by building a future with Emily. The thought gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The next few weeks brought subtle but meaningful changes. Emily grew more open, sharing snippets of her life that she had previously guarded fiercely. She told Matthew about her favorite books, her struggles in school, and her dreams of designing a skyscraper that would one day stand in the heart of a big city. One evening, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Emily surprised Matthew by handing him a sketchbook. "Here," she said, almost shyly, "I thought you might want to see this." Matthew opened the sketchbook, his eyes widening at the intricate drawings inside. There were detailed renderings of buildings, some modern and sleek, others whimsical and imaginative. Each one was labeled with notes about materials and design concepts. "Emily, these are incredible," he said sincerely. "You have so much talent." Emily shrugged, but there was a hint of pride in her expression. "It's just something I do to relax." "It's more than that," Matthew said firmly. "You've got a real gift. If architecture is something you want to pursue, I'll do whatever I can to help you." She looked at him, her expression softening. "My mom used to say that," she said quietly, "that I could do anything I set my mind to. And she was right," Matthew replied. "She believed in you, and so do I." Emily smiled, a real, genuine smile, and in that moment, Matthew felt like he was finally starting to earn her trust. But trust, he knew, was fragile. A setback came one evening when Emily received a progress report from school. Her grades were solid overall, but she had a failing grade in math. When Matthew brought it up, she immediately became defensive. "It's just one class," she said, crossing her arms. "Math isn't my thing." "I get that," Matthew said calmly, "but if you're struggling, we can figure out a way to help. Maybe a tutor." Emily rolled her eyes. "I don't need a tutor. I'll figure it out." Matthew nodded, not wanting to push too hard. "Okay, but if you change your mind, let me know. I'm here to help." A few days later, Emily surprised him by asking for help with her homework. It was a small gesture, but to Matthew, it was a sign that she was starting to trust him in ways she hadn't before. As the weeks turned into months, their bond continued to grow. They laughed together, argued occasionally, and celebrated small victories like when Emily aced a project in her art class. For Matthew, each moment felt like a step closer to becoming the father Emily deserved. But he also knew there were still challenges ahead. Emily's past couldn't be erased, and her journey to healing would take time. All he could do was show up every day and prove to her that she wasn't alone anymore. And for Matthew, that was more than enough. Winter arrived quietly, blanketing the town in soft layers of frost and a chill that hung in the air. The season brought with it an undeniable sense of reflection for Judge Matthew Coleman and his daughter, Emily. It had been months since the paternity test confirmed their connection. Months of tentative progress, breakthroughs, and the occasional setback. Yet, as they moved closer to the end of the year, both began to realize how much their lives had changed, and how much brighter their future looked. Emily was bustling around the living room one Saturday morning, her sketchbook open on the coffee table and her laptop displaying a slideshow of modern architectural designs. She was working on a school project, and her focus was as intense as ever. Matthew stood in the doorway, sipping his coffee and watching her with a quiet smile. "Need any help?" he asked. Emily didn't look up. "Not unless you know the structural integrity requirements for a cantilevered roof." Matthew chuckled. "I'll admit I'm out of my depth there." Emily glanced at him, smirking. "Didn't think so." It was a small moment, but for Matthew, it spoke volumes. Emily had grown more comfortable in his home, and her humor, sharp and dry, was emerging more often. It was proof of the bond they had built. Fragile at first but now growing stronger with each passing day. Later that evening, as snow began to fall softly outside, Matthew suggested an idea he'd been considering for weeks. "Emily," he said as they cleared the dinner table, "what do you think about making this arrangement more permanent?" Emily froze, a plate still in her hands. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Matthew said gently, "what if we started the process to make you officially part of my family? Not just through the court system, but as your legal guardian, or even adopting you." The plate clattered slightly as Emily set it down. Her face was a mixture of surprise, hope, and skepticism. You'd want to do that? For me? Matthew stepped closer, his voice steady and full of emotion. Of course I would. You're my daughter, Emily, and I want to be there for you, not just now, but always. Emily's eyes glistened, but she crossed her arms in her usual defensive posture. What if I'm too much? What if I mess everything up? Matthew crouched slightly to meet her gaze. Emily, nobody's perfect. Not me. Not you. Not anyone. But being a family isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up, no matter what. And I promise you, I'll always show up. For a long moment, Emily didn't say anything. Then, finally, she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Okay. The legal process was neither quick nor simple, but Matthew tackled it with the same determination he brought to his work. Ms. Carter, Emily's social worker, guided them through the paperwork and hearings. Throughout it all, Emily watched everything unfold with cautious optimism, her skepticism gradually giving way to hope. During one particularly emotional hearing, the presiding judge asked Emily directly, "Do you feel safe and supported in Judge Coleman's care? Is this what you want?" Emily glanced at Matthew, then back at the judge. "Yes," she said firmly, "for the first time in a long time. I feel like I belong somewhere." Matthew's heart swelled with pride and gratitude, and he knew that moment would stay with him forever. By the time the adoption was finalized, winter was nearing its end. The day the paperwork came through, Matthew surprised Emily with a small celebration at home. He had decorated the dining room with balloons and a banner that read, "Welcome home, Emily." When Emily walked in, she froze, her eyes darting to the decorations and then to Matthew. "What's all this?" Matthew grinned. "It's official. You're stuck with me now." Emily rolled her eyes, but her lips curved into a smile. "You're such a dork. Guilty as charged," Matthew replied, "but a very proud dork." They sat down for dinner, and for the first time, Emily initiated the conversation, telling Matthew about her latest school project, a sustainable community center. Matthew listened intently, marveling at her passion and creativity. "You're going to do amazing things, Emily," he said when she finished. "I hope you know that." Emily looked down at her plate, then back up at him. "I hope so. But, thanks for everything. Always," Matthew said softly. The months that followed were filled with small but significant milestones. Emily's grades improved, thanks in part to a math tutor Matthew had insisted on hiring. Her sketches became more ambitious, and she started applying to art and design-focused high schools. Matthew found himself rearranging his work schedule to attend her school events and support her dreams in every way he could. One evening, as they sat together watching a movie, Emily leaned against Matthew's shoulder, a quiet gesture of trust and comfort that he didn't take for granted. After a while, she spoke, her voice barely audible. "I'm glad I have you," she said. Matthew smiled, his throat tightening with emotion. "I'm glad I have you too, Emily." Their journey hadn't been easy, and it was far from over. But as winter melted into spring, Matthew and Emily found themselves looking forward to the future with hope. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were thriving. Together, they had built a new beginning, one filled with laughter, love, and the unshakable bond of family. And for both of them, that was more than enough.